Episode 12: How to Work with Advisors. Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fellen, and this is the Next Gen Mentor Podcast. This series is for you if you've grown up with family wealth always there in the background, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and often not spoken about directly. And now that wealth is becoming something that you will soon have to relate to, and I'm here to help you prepare to do that. Last time we spoke about how families can lose everything, amongst other things, if they become too dependent on advisors. Now we move one step further towards them in order to understand what they actually do versus what people assume that they do, their incentives, their motivations, and their limitations, and learn how to stay engaged without becoming reactive or dependent, because your relationship with them may be the most important one that you have.
I hear a lot about advisors, lawyers, bankers, trustees, asset managers. What do they actually do?
Well, that's as good a place to start as any, since there is often a gap between what people assume advisors do and what they actually do in practice. Most people imagine advisors as experts who guide decisions, people who analyze situations, present options, and help you choose the best course of action. And in part, that's true. They do bring technical knowledge, they do structure information, and they do help you see things that you might otherwise miss. But that's only one part of the picture. In reality, advisors operate inside the same system that you are entering. They're not outside it, they're part of it. They have relationships, they have incentives and motivations, they have constraints, and they respond to the environment that they are in, just as you will. If you don't see that clearly, you risk misunderstanding their role entirely. Let me give you an example. I once sat in a meeting with a family where several advisors were present: lawyers, investment professionals, and tax specialists. Each presented their view clearly and confidently. On paper, it looked like a comprehensive, balanced discussion. But if you listened more carefully, something else was happening. Each advisor was not only explaining the situation, they were framing it in a way that aligned with how they saw the world, and in some cases, with what they were responsible for delivering. The lawyer focused on structure and protection. The investment advisor focused on returns and allocation. The tax specialist focused on efficiency. None of them were wrong, but none of them were neutral either. And that's the first thing to understand. Advisors do not just provide answers, they shape how questions are asked. They are not neutral.
Does that mean I shouldn't trust them?
No, I wouldn't go as far as that. That would be the wrong conclusion. The point is not to distrust advisors, it's to understand them. Once you do that, your position will change. Instead of seeing them as authorities to define answers, you begin to see them as contributors to your understanding, each with a perspective, a bias, and a role. And that matters because it determines whether you remain in control of your decisions or gradually hand that control over. Think back to our earlier sessions, particularly when we discussed systems in session 3. One thing should feel familiar here. You're not stepping into a neutral environment. You're stepping into an existing structure with existing relationships and patterns. Advisors are part of that structure, often deeply embedded in it. Some may have worked with your family for decades. Some may have strong relationships with particular family members. Some may influence decisions more than their formal role suggests. And just as we discussed in the session on decision making, influence is rarely evenly distributed. The same applies here. Some advisors will carry more weight than others, not because of their title, but because of trust, history, and perceived judgment.
What about their motivations? Should I be worried about that?
Yes, not overtly, but consistently, because incentives shape behavior, and behavior shapes advice. This doesn't mean the advisors act in bad faith, and in most cases they don't. But they do operate within a framework, A lawyer is incentivized to protect. An investment manager is incentivized to allocate and perform. A trustee is incentivized to preserve and administer. Even when they're aligned with your interests, their perspective is shaped by what they are responsible for. And if you don't recognize that, you may assume that their view is complete, when in fact it is partial. This is very similar to what we discussed when looking at risk in episode 8. Risk is not just technical, it's behavioral. Advice works in the same way. It's not just information, it's interpretation.
I sometimes feel that advisors speak in a way that is so technical that it's difficult to follow.
Of course, it's their job to know more than you. After all, they're experienced, they've seen situations before, they speak with confidence. But there is a risk in that approach. If you rely on advisors without engaging with what they're saying, something can begin to happen. You can remain involved but not informed, present but not grounded. And that creates a kind of dependency, the type that we discussed in the last session. And that can help a family lose everything. Not because anyone is trying to control you, but because you're no longer in a position to judge. So the question is not whether you use advisors. You will. You should. The question is how you work with them without losing control.
What does that look like in practice over time?
Well, it's a lot less dramatic than it sounds. It doesn't mean making every decision yourself. It doesn't mean challenging everything. It does not mean reducing their role. It just means staying engaged. And engagement in this context is something quite specific. It means understanding the structure as what is being proposed. It means asking questions until something becomes clear. It means recognizing where assumptions are being made. And it does mean forming a view, even if it is not yet fully formed. This connects directly to what we discussed in the 9th session on risk. Engaging early is not about being right, it's about building judgment, and the same applies here. Let me try and be a bit more precise. There are 3 common positions that people fall into when working with advisors. The first is a passive reliance. They listen, they nod, they accept. Decisions are made efficiently, but understanding remains limited, and over time, dependency increases. The second is reactive challenge. They question absolutely everything, often very late in the process, sometimes without fully understanding the whole context. This creates friction and reduces trust. And the third is deliberate engagement. They listen carefully, they ask. When something is unclear, they form a view, and they contribute at the right moment. And that third position is what you are aiming for.
How do I know when to ask questions and when to just listen?
Well, this is where it's important that you're starting to form your judgment. At the beginning, you'll listen more than you speak. It's natural. You're still building context. But listening does not mean disengaging. You are listening actively. You're noticing how things are explained. You're noticing what is emphasized and what is not. You're noticing whether different advisors see the situation in the same way. And when something does not fully make sense, you ask, not to challenge, but to understand. Because as we discussed in the episode on decision making, contribution always improves process. Confrontation, on the other hand, disrupts it.
What happens if I don't understand something but don't want to look inexperienced?
You've put your finger on one of the most common traps and one of the most costly, because not asking does not remove the gap, it simply hides it. And hidden gaps tend to surface later at the wrong moment, under pressure. Remember from the very first session that many people inherit structures that they do not fully understand. This is one of the ways that happens. So I've got a simple rule here. If something is unclear, that is not a weakness. It's information. Use it.
What about when advisors disagree?
This is where things become more interesting. because disagreement reveals structure. You'll see different interpretations, different priorities, different ways of framing the same situation. And instead of trying to find the right answer immediately, it's often more useful to just step back. What is each person focusing on? What are they trying to protect or trying to achieve? What assumptions sit behind their view? This is not about resolving the disagreement instantly. It's about understanding the landscape more clearly. And over time, that is what allows you to make better decisions. Not because you have perfect information, but because you simply see more of it. There's another point here that I really want to make. Advisors are often at their best when they are part of a balanced system, not when they're dominant, not when they're ignored, but when their input is combined and your role gradually becomes one of integration. You're not there to replace them. You're not there to follow them blindly. You're there to bring their perspectives together and make a decision. This is where your earlier learning begins to connect. From session 3, you understand that you're inside a system. From session 4, you understand that your identity must be constructed and not borrowed. From session 5, you understand that credibility comes from behavior. And from session 8, you understand that judgment develops through engagement. Now you can begin to apply all of that in a very practical way in how you work with advisors. Do this over time and something shifts. You're no longer just receiving advice, you're shaping how advice is used. You're no longer reacting to what is presented, you're now participating in how it is formed. And importantly, you're no longer dependent on the system, you are operating within it deliberately. And this is where the relationship with advisors becomes a lot more defined in practice. Because up to now, much of what we have discussed has been about understanding systems, decisions, and your position within them. But advisors sit right at the intersection of all three.
I noticed that sometimes advisors seem to lead the whole conversation. Is that normal?
Yes, and it actually happens more often than you might expect. Usually it doesn't happen suddenly, it just develops. At the beginning, advisors are brought in for specific expertise, a legal question, an investment decision, a structural issue. They contribute, they clarify, they support. Over time, as complexity increases, their involvement often deepens. They attend more meetings, get retained. They're included earlier in discussions. They begin to carry context across different topics. And at some point, something shifts. They're no longer just responding to questions. They're helping to define them. Now, this is not inherently a problem. In many cases, in fact, it's probably necessary. But it does change the balance, because when advisors begin to shape the direction of discussion rather than simply contribute to it, their influence increases. And if that influence is not matched by your own engagement, something else happens on the sidelines. You begin to follow the structure that they are creating. This connects directly to what we discussed in session 3. Systems evolve. They don't remain static. And when a system becomes more complex, those who understand it best tend to influence it most. Often, that includes advisors.
Is that where dependency starts?
Well, that's where it can certainly begin. Like much of what we've discussed, dependency is rarely a single decision. It is a pattern. It forms where understanding is gradually replaced by reliance, when questions are asked less often, when explanations are accepted without being fully absorbed. And over time, the relationship shifts. You're still present, of course, still involved, but the center of gravity has somehow moved elsewhere. This is one of the more subtle risks. because it doesn't feel like losing control. It actually feels like efficiency. Things move quickly, decisions are made, complexity is handled. And from the outside, everything appears to function well. But beneath that, something important may be missing, and that is your own judgment. You may remember from session one that one of the early risks is becoming passive within a system that continues to operate around you. This is one of the ways that passivity can develop, not through disengagement, but through over reliance.
I really don't want to slow things down by asking too many questions.
You're not alone. It's a very common trait, and it often leads to the same outcome. You hold back, you listen, you assume that clarity will come over time. Sometimes it does, but often it does not, because understanding is not something that accumulates, it's built actively. There's a difference here that is worth making clear. Asking questions is not the same as slowing things down. Unfocused questioning does that, but precise questioning does exactly the opposite. It improves the quality of the discussion. This connects directly to what we explored in session 9. A well-placed question can change the direction of a conversation. It can bring clarity where there is ambiguity. It can expose assumptions that have not been tested. But most importantly, it signals that you are engaged.
What kind of questions should I be asking advisors then?
Well, not technical ones, at least not at the beginning. Those will come later, believe me. At this stage, the most valuable questions are structural. What's actually being decided here? What's the alternative? What assumptions are we making? What are we not considering? These questions don't challenge the advisor, they clarify the situation. And over time, something can change. Advisors adjust how they communicate with you. They explain more clearly. They anticipate your questions. They begin to treat you not as a recipient of advice, but as part of the decision making process. This is where your role becomes more active. There's also another dimension that becomes visible over time. Not all advisors operate in the same way. Some are very precise, some are more general. Some focus narrowly on their area, others take a broader view. And understanding these differences can be very useful because it allows you to interpret what you're hearing more accurately. Let me give you an example. A highly specialized advisor may give you an answer that is technically correct, but narrow. Another may give you a broader perspective, but with less depth. Now, neither is wrong, but they are different, and your role is to bring those perspectives together. This is where earlier learning begins to connect again. From session 5, you know that respect is built through behavior, particularly preparation and consistency. The same applies here. If you prepare properly, if you understand the context, your interaction with advisors changes. You're no longer asking basic questions repeatedly. You're now asking better questions, more precise ones, and that shifts the whole dynamic.
I sometimes feel that advisors speak in a way that is so technical that it's difficult to follow.
That's not unusual amongst experts. Advisors often operate within their own language, legal language, financial language, technical language. And while that language is precise, it's not always accessible. They just assume that everyone understands. There is a simple principle here. If you do not understand something, whether it's an acronym or a concept, it has not yet been properly explained. Not to you, at any rate. And it is entirely reasonable to ask for it to be explained or clarified in simpler terms, because clarity is your responsibility. Remember from session 10 that governance is ultimately about clarity. Who decides how they decide and on what basis? Well, if you don't understand the advice being given, you can't really fully participate in that process. And if you can't participate, you are, by definition, dependent. There's also something else to be aware of. Advisors can see each other as rivals for your attention. They do not always agree with each other, and sometimes they don't even like each other. And when they do not, the situation can feel uncertain.
I think I would find it so confusing when I hear two advisors say different things.
Yes, that's a moment where many people step back because it feels safer to defer. But in reality, it's one of the most valuable moments for learning. Disagreement reveals assumptions. It shows you how different people interpret the same situation. It highlights where trade offs exist. It forces clarity, and instead of trying to resolve it immediately, you can use it to understand more deeply. Why does each advisor see it this way? What are they prioritizing? What risks are they focusing on? This is very similar to what we discussed when looking at decision making patterns. Dis- Different perspectives are not a problem to be eliminated, they are information to be understood. Over time, this builds something important: judgment, the ability to weigh different views, to recognize when something feels incomplete. And that is what keeps you in control. Not knowing everything, but understanding enough to form a view. There is another pattern that's worth noticing. Advisors often become more influential when families become less engaged, not because they seek control, but because someone has to carry the decision making process forward. You may recall from the 11th session that when engagement reduces, reliance increases. And when reliance increases, influence shifts. And this is how systems gradually change direction. So your role is not to reduce the role of advisors, it's to remain engaged alongside them.
What does that look like in practice over time?
While it looks consistent, you read what's sent to you, you prepare before meetings, you ask when something is unclear, you reflect afterwards on what was discussed. None of this is dramatic, of course, but over time it compounds. And eventually something shifts again. Advisors will begin to rely on you as well, not for technical answers, but for judgment, for context, for decisions. At that point, the relationship becomes balanced, the way it should be. They bring expertise, you bring understanding, and decisions are made between those two. This is where control actually sits, in integrating advice, and that is a different position entirely. You're no longer being guided through decisions, you're now part of how those decisions are formed. There is one final point to consider here, and it's less visible. And that is that over time, your relationship with advisors becomes a pattern itself. And that pattern influences how they behave with you. If you're passive, they will lead. If you're reactive, they will defend. If you're engaged, they will collaborate. This is not something that's agreed explicitly, but it just develops. And once it's established, it tends to persist. So, what you're building here is not just understanding, it's also a way of working. And this is where something quite subtle can begin to matter more than it first appears. Not what advisors say, but how you listen to it.
I tend to focus on the outcome. Is that enough?
Not really, sadly. The outcome is the most visible part. It's also the most comfortable part to engage with. Gives you something clear, something that feels actionable. But the real value sits underneath it, how that conclusion was reached. Two advisors may give you similar recommendations. On the surface, they appear aligned. But if you look more closely, the reasoning may be very different. One may be focused on preserving capital, another on generating growth. One may be assuming stability, another may be preparing for change. The recommendation looks the same, the logic is not. And over time, those differences matter. This is where your attention needs to shift from outcome to reasoning. What is driving this advice? What needs to be true for it to work? Where is the uncertainty? You will not always ask these questions out loud, but you should be asking them to yourself internally. This links back to something we discussed earlier about risk. Risk is not just what can go wrong, It's what you have not yet fully understood. And when you begin to listen for reasoning rather than just outcomes, that understanding deepens.
I sometimes feel like I should already understand far more than I do.
That feeling will come and go, and it can be misleading because it often leads to a particular behavior you can stop asking, not because you understand, but because you feel you should. That is one of the few patterns that genuinely slows development. Not lack of knowledge, but lack of engagement with what you do not yet know. There's no expectation that you grasp everything immediately. I've made that point various times. But there is value in staying with something until it becomes clear, even if that does take time, even if it requires going back over the same point more than once. Because each time you do that, something shifts slightly. You move from recognizing terms to understanding concepts, to seeing how they connect. And once that connection begins to form, your confidence changes. Not outwardly at first, but internally. You begin to notice that you're no longer simply following the conversation. You're now contributing to it through how you interpret what is being said, through what you choose to question, and through what you choose to accept. And that's where the transition really happens. Not when you know everything, but when you begin to think for yourself within the structure that you are now part of. So let me leave you with this. Working with advisors is not about control. It's not about knowing more than they do. It's not about pushing back on everything. It's about staying present, about understanding enough to form a view, about asking when something is unclear, and about recognizing that advice is perspective, not certainty. If you do that consistently, you will move from receiving advice to working with it, from reacting to participating, from relying to judging. And that is where your position changes fundamentally. So the key takeaways from this session are simple, but not easy. Number one, stay engaged, even when it would be easier not to be. Number two, ask questions to understand, not to challenge. Number three, focus on how conclusions are reached, not just what they are. Number four, recognize incentives and motivations and limitations without becoming cynical. And five, build your own judgment gradually through consistent involvement. If you can hold on to that, you will find that advisors remain valuable, but they don't define your decisions. You do. In our next session, we will look at the difference between good advice and comfortable advice, and why some advice feels right but leads in the wrong direction, and when and how to challenge constructively. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.